Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Taking a Pragmatic Approach to the Circular Economy. My name is Mike Holman. I'm a VP here at Lux Research, and I'm moderating today's session for our speaker today, who is Anthony Schiavo, Research Director at Lux. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have into the questions box on the screen. We'll answer as many of those as we can in the time we have here, but if your question does not get answered, feel free to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. So with that, I'll hand it over to Anthony.
Thanks, Mike. Today, we're going to be talking about taking a pragmatic approach to the circular economy. I was talking to a client of mine so many months ago, and they said that they felt Lux was great at telling them all the ways that technologies might fail or that things might not work. But they really wanted to understand how they could make technology innovation work for the circular economy. That's a big question and has a lot of facets. But I think one of the most important facets is how well does the innovation ecosystem work? How well are different communities and groups at taking technologies from early stages to commercialization? Are we funding the right companies and the right technologies for the circular economy and for sustainability a bit more broadly? So today, we're going to be looking a lot at that. How well do these companies work? How well do innovators work? Who's getting funding? And are we on the right path for the circular economy? I want to start with U.S. Special Envoy to Climate and former presidential candidate John Kerry, who said 50% of carbon reductions are going to come from technologies we don't yet have. Now, he kind of got roasted on Twitter for this, but I agree with him, at least in spirit. There are a lot of technologies that are still at the relatively early stages that need to transition from those early stages to commercialization. It's worth asking ourselves, how is that going to happen? Well, if it was 1935, all the activity would probably be in big corporate labs. At this time, innovation was very expensive. Only corporations could really do it at large scale. And you had companies like DuPont, very famously doing a lot of basic research and inventing things that they didn't really understand or have a clear purpose for. Then by the 60s, the government had really stepped in and taken the lead as an innovator with very mission-focused and sort of priority-led innovation. Obviously, most famously, sort of the Apollo, the moon race, being not only a major innovation and a success in and of itself, but spawning tons of other innovations that ultimately made their way into sort of the general public and general industry. But today, however, we're really in an era of open innovation in which corporations have kind of recognized that there is a startup ecosystem out there working on technology innovations. And the best ideas, the best business models, the best thoughts, they all might be outside one company or really any company. So you have venture capitalists and corporate venture capitalists, you have startup incubators and corporate accelerators. This whole network of companies and partnerships really focused on those early stage innovations. But what's crucial to recognize here is that the innovation ecosystem has a huge responsibility. Unlike 1935, when it was really just focused on basic science, or 1960s, 70s, when it was the moon race, now today we have the responsibility not just for economic outcomes, but for sustainable outcomes. And really, we need to mitigate the worst potential impacts of climate change with these innovations. So how is this open innovation ecosystem doing with sustainability? Well, funding for sustainability and sustainability-driven companies is definitely on the rise. This here is a chart of funding over the last 20 years or so. And you can see that in 2020, almost $43 billion went to sustainable companies. But what I really want to focus in on today is venture capital. In 2020, there were 14 billion venture capital funding, total funding for these sustainable companies. And I think this is crucial because it's really the very earliest stages of funding. It's going to be the most sort of impactful for these early stage technologies that we need. Now, you might look at this and say, well, 14 billion is a lot of money. A lot of sort of resources are flowing into this space. This is a good thing. And, that is true generally. But a money geyser is not really the same as good decision-making capability. And the reality is venture capitalists do not have a great track record with clean tech. You can go back to the solar boom of 2005 to 2011 and find a lot of examples. Companies like Canarca raising $185 million and shutting down. Nano Solar raising more than $400 million. And perhaps most infamously, Solyndra raised a lot of money from both VC and government sources before filing for bankruptcy. So with this spotty track record, we really need to get this right. This leaves us with two key questions. When we're looking at these sustainable and circular economy startups, which of these startups are likely to scale? And which of these startups get VC funding? With these two questions answered, we can really begin to understand how well this open innovation ecosystem is working at funding and accelerating these sustainable technologies that we need. How are we going to answer these questions? Well, we can use Lux's 12,000 interviews to help. Lux is a company. One of the core functions we do and one of the core sort of foundations of our research is the company profile, where we reach out and we interview the CEO of a startup, and we have a standardized sort of assessment methodology that can tell us a lot of different things. First, the scorecard metrics. Every startup that we interview is assessed on the 10 of the same scorecard metrics. These are essentially a measure of the quality of the company, of their technology and their business model. We're going to focus in on 4 of these metrics today. The technology and solution value, which is essentially a measure of if the technology provides significant advantages in terms of performance or in terms of price. There's an assessment of the management team, which looks at how complete the team is in terms of their experience. Do they have technology expertise, business expertise, startup expertise, as well as their track record and any red flags. We look at the technological and business partnerships that a company has, not just the customers. And in fact, the customers is actually a very small part of this, but those companies who have committed to helping a startup scale up or enhance their technology or adopt and integrate their technology into a particular business model or offering. And lastly, there's a momentum score, which is a measure of recent activity. Has the company been meeting its technological milestones? Has it been meeting its scale-up targets? Has it been achieving elements of its business plan when it said it was going to? Or conversely, has it been missing those milestones and missing those technology benchmarks? So these scorecard metrics are really a measure of quality. We also give a stage of development score. The stages of development range from concept, the very earliest stage, through lab development, market introduction, and then finally scale. And the stage of development, I think, is a pretty useful benchmark for success. Now, there are a number of ways we could measure success. You could look at revenues, which is something we do capture. You could try and look at the overall funding return on something like VC investment. But with the circular economy and with sustainability in general, I think we are pretty focused on, deployment of technology. We want to understand if these companies are really building a circular economy. So in that sense, the stage of development is, to me, the most useful sort of measure that we have of success. Lastly, of course, we'll be bringing in that funding data, and we're going to compare who's getting funding, at what stage, when are they getting funding. Now, all these scores are kind of on a 1 to 5 scale. You can see here the distributions of all the company scores across those 12,000 profiles. I don't want to dig too much into this, but I just want to say that relatively small differences in scores do have a big impact. Generally, the sort of a difference of about 0.8 is very statistically significant, and a difference in 0.4 on a score on a sort of a 1 to 5 scale is sort of the minimum for significance. If a group of companies has a 3, and then another group of companies has a 3.4 or a 3.5 on the technology score, that represents a real meaningful advantage in the average company's assessment by the analyst. So just keep those numbers in mind, 0.8 and 0.4 as we go forward. Okay, let's get back to these key questions. Which startups are likely to scale and which startups are likely to get VC funding? And we'll start with which are likely to scale. So of these 12,000 profiles, there's about 8,000 unique companies in there because we profile some companies multiple times. And of them, around 2,500 have achieved this scale stage. How do these scaled up companies compare to companies who have not yet scaled? Well, in terms of technology, there's really not a meaningful difference. But in terms of management, partnerships, and momentum, there are meaningful differences. And you can see that there's a very substantial difference, the biggest difference on the partnership side. And then there's also a very substantial or a fairly substantial difference in terms of the quality of the management. So we can see that scaled up startups have better management and better partnerships and typically better momentum, but they don't really have better technology. However, this is just a snapshot of companies who have already achieved success. What we really want to do is predict which startups will scale. So what predicts success? Well, we can look at companies we have briefed more than one time. This will give us a snapshot of sort of a before and after of those companies. Of these companies, we have 1,900 who were not initially successful when we briefed them. And of those, 450 went on to become successful when we briefed them later. So we can compare this 450 who went on to become successful to the rest of this cohort and see what was the difference. What set these 450 apart? What predicted their success? Well, again, it's not really technology. We didn't see a very substantial difference in the scores. What's interesting, though, is that it's not really management either. This flies in the face of a lot of conventional sort of VC logic and just the general accepted practice in the startup space, which is that the founding team, the management, these early innovators are the most crucial part of any startup experience. Rather, we saw a pretty significant difference on partnerships, but especially on momentum that really stood out as the things that set apart those companies who went on to become successful. So from this, partnerships and momentum are the best predictors of future success, not management, where a lot of VC funding goes. So it's worth asking us, though, as we sort of turn, which startups are actually getting the VC funding. I want to come back to those failed solar investments that we mentioned earlier, the era of Kanarka and its contemporaries. 48 companies were profiled by Lux Research during this time because we were active in this space during this time frame of 2005 to 2011. These 48 companies received a total of $2.8 billion in funding, and of them, just 2 were successful. I think this is such a fascinating case study because the almost uniform failure of these startups really gives us a clean slate, an even playing field to assess who is getting the VC funding, given that essentially all the startups were equally unsuccessful. Well, let's compare the top 10 companies who absorbed the majority of the funding with the overall average of those 48 companies. Again, we do not see a substantial difference in tech. There's a slight difference in the management scores, a slight bump for the top 10 funded. And the top 10 funded actually performed worse in terms of partnerships than the average company. And in terms of momentum, they were really bang on. They were really dead even. So really fully get a picture here, you need to dig into the analyst comments. Each one of these scores is not just a number. It is a whole commentary box that the analyst has written their opinions. And this gives us a much richer, much more detailed understanding of what's going on here. And when you do, what you find is that these companies, well, they got slightly higher average than scores in terms of management. In the comments, the top 10 were uniformly staffed with experienced solar players, influential innovators, and generally well-connected types who could really get that funding. So this kind of matches our assumption that VC funding goes towards and favors management. But what about the circular economy? What about today? We've been talking a lot about the past, but how are we doing? Are we doing better than that disastrous set of solar investments? Well, recently, Lux has profiled more than 505 companies in the circular economy space. They've received more than $10 billion in funding. And of this 505, 47 successful companies. So already, I think this is a little bit better than in the past. But again, we want to look at who gets VC funding. Of this 505 companies, there's 150 who have received $1 million or more in funding. And 350 did not get VC funding at all. I want to return to the wisdom of another previous presidential candidate, one Mr. Kanye West, who says, having money ain't everything, not having it is. This break point, this gap between $1 million in VC funding or more and not getting VC funded at all is a pretty substantial difference. It's a pretty substantial milestone and valley, if you will, in the life of a startup. Now, not every single one of these companies needed that 1 million. Some of them were, privately funded, or they were JVs between bigger companies. But the majority of these companies are smaller, early stage startups who could really benefit from that VC money. So the question is, are these 150 who are getting this money better than the companies who are not? Let's compare. Again, we do not see a substantial difference in terms of technology. And again, we can see that there's a substantial bias towards strong management teams in the VC space. However, the VC groups are doing better. Generally speaking, we do see a meaningful uplift in terms of partnerships and momentum when we compare the VC funded cohort against the not funded cohort. So that is good. However, a lot of companies are slipping through the cracks. And in particular, a lot of technologies that are just as good as some of the others are slipping through the cracks here of this VC funding ecosystem. And what that means is that impactful technologies might not make it to the market, even if they're just as good as some of the others. There's plenty of companies out there that, sort of meet this criteria of, likely to succeed, that have high momentum scores, that have high partnership scores, but have not yet received a substantial amount of VC funding. Just to highlight 3 of those companies. Magnomer is an interesting group. They're developing a novel ink that enables magnetic-based recycling of plastic waste. Got a company, Spectolite, which is developing a sort of novel plant-based alternative for a pretty wide range of different products. You can see some cups here. And this last company, Not PLA or NotPla, they have developed these unique pods. It's a very, I think, frankly, weird, but very interesting innovation. These are something that you can use to store drinks and might completely eliminate the plastic needed for single-use packaging. Like I said, all 3 of these companies have the kind of partnerships and momentum that we look for that predict success, but have not yet really achieved that mainstream VC funding. So there are opportunities out here, and I would encourage everyone listening to this to consider some of these more lower key technologies that are still flying under the radar. With that, I just want to leave you with a few final thoughts. Firstly, what we've seen is that funders, especially VC, bias towards good management or strong management, but that does not necessarily predict success. Good management is something you can bring in afterwards. Second, there's plenty of good technology outside the existing VC ecosystem. I encourage you to get this, to go outside that ecosystem to find these companies. And lastly, please get this right. We need to do it to save the planet. With that, I just want to thank you for your time and attention.
All right. Thank you very much, Anthony. We now have some time for questions on the presentation. So we've had a few coming in already, but please type any that you have into the questions box. And if we don't get to any of the questions, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. So Anthony, there's a few questions that relate to the just sort of the methodology here. So maybe you can expand a little bit on like how these criteria were chosen and what the approach for rating the companies on them has been.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of go back a step, there's some level of selection bias when you look at the 1,200 companies overall. We're not picking those companies randomly, right? We're trying to go out and talk to the most interesting companies, the companies that our clients want to hear from, companies that are maybe hyped or have received a lot of attention in the news, and companies that we think have promising technology. So this is not a selection of 12,000 random companies. This is a selection of 12,000 companies or 12,000 interviews that have kind of all the stragglers already weeded out. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you look at these scores and you see a pretty even distribution across the range. The reality is, a lot of startups fail. Most startups fail. There's some pre-selection that's happening here. The other thing I would highlight is, we have a relatively standardized set of interview questions. So this always comes from an interview with the CTO or the CEO, someone who's really an expert on both the technology and the business. We have a standardized set of questions that we're asking, and a standardized set of sort of, I would say, we have these definitions that go into each one of these metrics, right? Whether we focused on 4 today, but there's actually 10 total. We did do an analysis of the extent to which all of them are predictive. These were the 4 that were consistently the most predictive, sort of the most interesting, and saw these biggest divergence. We've actually done a pretty detailed analysis there. So these are the metrics that really stood out to us in terms of their predictive ability, but also they're the ones that people ask us about the most. The strength of the technology is something that's very, very important to our clients, who are often technologists, but I think it's a little surprising to them when they hear that, technology itself is not really a driver or a very predictive sort of tool to understand how successful a company is likely to be.
Do you think that's because of the pre-selection that you were mentioning, that you don't see more differentiation in the technology scores or more differentiation in success based on the technology scores because of, they're in part because a lot of these companies have been sort of chosen by virtue of having some type of relatively novel technology, like we wouldn't have chosen to write about them otherwise?
I think there's at least an element of that into it for sure, because if you look at a space like 3D printing that we covered, there were 300, 400 startups maybe in that space, and at least 200 were just MakerBot, RepRap, the same thing. They were melting plastics and they were putting it through a little extruder. And if we profiled every single one of those companies and gave them a 1 on the technology score, that would have changed the distribution. So for sure, there is a certain bias there. But I also think it does reflect the realities of bringing a startup to market. There are some pretty big, substantial, the opportunities for success are orders of magnitude apart from each other, right? Some companies are going to receive, hundreds of millions of dollars in funding and ultimately hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, and some might only get $1 million or $500,000 or no funding at all. So there's this huge delta in terms of the funding and the success, and I think that it really isn't matched by a similar delta in technology, right? The technologies are really fine-grained in terms of the differences, and often having a slightly better technology or even a substantially better technology doesn't necessarily drive a company towards success. So it's a little bit of both, I think. It's a good question.
Yeah, it's also, I think, that sometimes the higher rated technologies that are more of a radical departure may indeed be much better technologies and get higher scores, but sometimes those can also be more challenging to commercialize also because it's a bigger departure from the incumbent. So it could be a bit
Absolutely.
of a counteracting effect there. Speak about some of the particular the ones that the companies you showed right at the end there. A few questions on those. I think the Spectralite was one that sort of jumped out as these kind of plant-based, bio-based materials. So how do we see those? What is it that stands out about that company that prompted you to choose it? How does it in particular differentiate from some of like the plant-based bottles companies that Lux has been a little bit more skeptical about? It looked like a similar type of material there.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Because this is a company I think that probably we would be skeptical about. But what actually stood out to them was, these ratings. A lot of this is a place where we're kind of playing, I don't know, Moneyball here. My gut as a picker of startups was not super positive about this one, but actually they really stood out to me in those partnerships, and particularly the momentum, the speed with which they're launching new products and building production facilities and sort of moving to scale. Because yeah, you look, we're very negative on or not plastic bottles, but paper bottles. There are a lot of these other issues surrounding the technology itself. Can it compete in terms of like moisture barrier? What's going to happen with the overall sustainable footprint? What's going to happen, like, with the end of life of some of these paper technologies? And Spectralite, I think, is a company that hasn't necessarily fully solved these technology issues, but in sort of the spirit of being a bit more metrics driven, I wanted to highlight some of these companies that maybe, the analysts ourselves, might not, might bias against, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the end of life, the recyclability has been one of the big issues with those type of materials, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely something to dig into. I think an interesting question here. So you focused a lot on VC funding, right? But there's other sources of financing that can be available for some of these early stage technologies. Government funding, maybe most notably in a lot of areas, though potentially private equity or other types of
Mm-hmm.
corporate backing or things like that as well. What role do you see those other types of funding playing ultimately, especially if maybe VCs are doing better, but maybe still missing some things? Like, is there opportunity for some of these other funding sources to kind of step in and fill that gap more effectively?
I think there's an interesting role for government funding here. A lot of the government funding is really focused on this kind of model where you solve a specific challenge that one of the government agencies has, and then that technology then gets transferred out to other applications. You see this a lot with NASA. You see this a lot with the DoD, and that's how a lot of their most famous technologies, Velcro, right, or any of these things, get commercialized, right? Is it starts with, oh, NASA has this problem, and then ultimately ends up, on pots and pans. I think this is not a very good model for the circular economy and for sustainability. However, um, the government doesn't necessarily have, the problems that NASA has are not ones of biodegradability or recyclability, right? And same with the DoD. This works for performance materials. It works for semiconductors. It works for a lot of these more performance-driven spaces. But I think that model of government funding isn't necessarily as good. I think a group that's doing it well is, in the energy space, you've got, the DOE doing a lot of very project-specific funding where they're putting out calls for certain types of technologies, or they're funding certain types of challenges. And I think that type of challenge-driven funding is a good model going forward, where it's and partly because the DOE is much more tied into these sustainability issues than like NASA is, right? That helps. But this sort of model of funding where they say, look, this is a problem out in the real world, come up with solutions for it, not this is a problem that the government agency has and we want you to solve. So um,
Yeah.
I think that type of model of funding works better, but a lot of the challenges are still out there.
Yeah, I mean, you even mentioned the Apollo program, right? And people will sometimes say, oh, we need an Apollo program for clean energy, or an Apollo program for this or for that. But it's a bit of a different type of problem, right?
Yeah, and the government's role in just innovation and the overall the economy is just much different and frankly much smaller, I think, than it was in the 60s and 70s and the post-war, so that this post-World War II era years. The whole economy was just organized very differently. So I don't think you're going to see an Apollo program. I don't think we need an Apollo program. I think it is a different time, as you said.
All right, well, that is about all the time we have. So we're going to be wrapping up the webinar for today. We will send the slide presentation and the recording from the webinar to all the attendees. You should get an email later today on that. After you leave the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on the presentation. So we always appreciate any feedback we can get there, and it helps to inform and improve our future webinars. So thank you all very much for joining us. Thanks, Anthony, for the great presentation, and everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you all.